everybody. Welcome to Psychedelics. Today, this is David Rapkin having a conversation with Gabrielle Lehigh. And Gabby, you are now a doctor. So congratulations. How's it feeling being a doctor at last?
Thank you. It's really exciting. It's quite the achievement. It's been something I've been working for a long time, but it's also odd. It's kind of like waking up on your birthday where you've been excited for it for a long time, but you also wake up not really feeling any different. So it's a little bit of a mixed feeling, but it is something very exciting.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that feeling. It's like, now what? After you've been working
Yeah.
towards something for so long. And before we pressed record, I asked you, do you want me to introduce you as Dr. Gabby Lehigh or just Gabby Lehigh? And you're like, yeah, it's cool. What does it mean to you? Like, what did it mean to you doing this work? And we're going to dive into what your work was about. But yeah, what does it mean just having reached this stage of your professional life?
Um, it's something that if you would have told my like 5 or 10-year-old self that I was going to do in my life, I probably one wouldn't have known what you meant by a doctor, and two, I probably wouldn't have believed you. So coming from a family, I'm a first generation college student, and I go all the way from my undergrad to a master's to a PhD. This is, and the first person in my entire family, and I'm pretty sure even on the married side of my family too, to have a PhD. This is really something important to me. And I think the big question now is like, what do I do now? I've accomplished the big thing and I'm like, oh, now I have to figure out what I do with it, which is kind of part of the adventure too. So,
Yeah, and it's beautiful as well. Before moving into that, what next? Just to kind of sit in that rejoiceful, like I did it kind of space. It's a lot of work, and yeah, the way you were just talking about your family's experiences, yeah, this means a lot to your family, to your ancestors, to the little you, 5, 10 years ago, or when you were a little girl. So it's a big deal. So congratulations on behalf of Psychedelics today and the younger youth. Congrats on doing this. It's massive. So
thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
yeah, and we're going to talk about your PhD thesis because it is super interesting. Like, I can't wait, but I'm going to make myself wait. I want to get to know about psychedelic grad as well. But first, yeah, maybe just tell folks a little bit about you, Gabby. Like, just introduce to you, your life, and how you came upon the wonderful world of psychedelics.
Oh boy. This is interesting because this is probably the first time that I've gotten to really share my story, without it just being like a one-on-one conversation with someone. But I was born and raised in Pennsylvania. My parents were both factory workers. I worked in a factory for a couple years too, during my undergrad and after I graduated with my undergraduate degree. I studied at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, which is a little confusing. It's a little town called Indiana, but it's in the state of Pennsylvania and has no affiliation with Indiana University. But I went there for my undergrad and studied anthropology. And even finding my way to anthropology was a little bit of a interesting road because when I went into my undergrad, I wanted to study music. I'd, been playing music since I was young. But I was too anxious and too nervous to audition for the music school. So I just went in as an undeclared fine arts major. And I had a professor in English, Dr. Black, and I spent some time in her office. And I said to her once, I don't really know what I want to do. All I know is I want to help people. And she's like, I studied anthropology. She's like, you might want to look into anthropology because anthropologists can do a lot of different things and they like to help people. So that's kind of how I found my way to anthropology. And for several years in my undergrad and my master's, which I did my master's in anthropology at the University of South Florida too, um, as well as my PhD at University of South Florida. But in my master's and my undergrad, I studied environmental justice. So I was really interested in looking at communities who often don't have the agency or the voice to stand up to powerful uh, corporations, right, that often cause environmental and human health um, problems. So I studied like a Homer City power plant, which is a coal-fired power plant in Indiana, Pennsylvania. And I talked to residents about their experiences, some of them being employed. Well, actually, I didn't end up talking to anyone who's employed at the power plant because they were all too afraid to talk to me because they were afraid of losing their jobs, right? But I talked to community members, and everyone talks about like this power plant is this financial staple in the community, and how do people balance that while at the same time they wake up and they walk outside in the morning and they left their laundry hanging on the line outside and it's covered in like this sooty, greasy kind of film. And it's all of this like fallout that comes from, burning coal at the power plant. And people talk about health issues. Their children have asthma. It had the highest rate of asthma in like all of Pennsylvania. All of these health disparities, all of these environmental impacts. So that's what I did in my undergrad. And I kind of followed suit a little bit when I did my master's degree. But I worked in a community here in Tampa, Florida, just working with a community center. They were developing a property that wasn't being used for anything. And they wanted to make sure that they incorporated community ideas and participation in making this park. And so I worked with them to make sure that they were like engaging participant or engaging community members. And I interviewed residents as participants in my study. And I published an article on it about different kind of levels of community engagement and how that impacts long-term sustainability of different projects. So I guess all of that is really just to say that I didn't find my way to psychedelics for a very long time. And I finally found my way there. I had to be probably in the last year or two of my master's thesis. And what it was is I'd been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and general anxiety disorder. And my boyfriend at the time, now fiance, he recognized that some of the things that I'd been on SSRIs for like 9 years and like, it just wasn't productive after a certain point. And he was just like, he had started doing research and heard about psychedelics being used for therapy. And, the recording of this podcast is very, it kind of brings it back to the beginning because he learned so much by listening to the Psychedelics Today podcast. Like that was really like his starting point to like learning about all of this, which ultimately kind of leads me here today, which is so interesting that it brings it all back together. But he started learning more about it, reading about the MAPS studies, listening to the podcast, just kind of like absorbing all this information to finally come to me and be like, hey, this is what's going on. People are using this to treat PTSD and looking at it for anxiety and depression and all of these different things. And I finally took the leap and I took the journey and I personally tried psychedelics and it completely changed my life. I was at a point where like the SSRIs just weren't working and I was at a really detrimental point in my life where I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, honestly. And psychedelics gave me a completely new outlook on life. There are definitely times where it was challenging and in some ways absolutely terrifying, but it made me kind of explore my shadow self and confront these traumas that I literally was in denial about for the longest time. And as I was working through all of that, I started thinking about, I finished my master's degree and I was headed into the Ph.D. and I was like, what do I want to study for my Ph.D? Because this one really matters because a lot of people will publish on it for a long time. It usually kind of puts them in whatever field that they're going to pursue for the rest of their career. So I wanted to make sure whatever I picked that it was going to be something that I was going to be passionate about. And I was like, how do I kind of started with like, taking trips at home and being like kind of these pipe dream kind of moments where I was like, wouldn't it be so cool if I studied psychedelics for my dissertation? I was like, but nobody does that. So I can't do that, And then the more like I talked about it and I verbalized it, and then I started talking about it outside of trips and I started brainstorming this idea of like, how does it look? What can this look like? What would I do? How would I study it? What I want to study? And I went to my advisor at the time and I said, listen, I want to change the direction that I've been going in. I'm like, I either want to study the anthropology of space colonization, which is so out there,
Wow.
or I want to study psychedelics. And
Wow.
my advisor was like, neither one of those is anywhere near what you were studying before. Like, what happened, right? And I really appreciate the advisor that I had at that time, because he was honest with me and was like, I'm not equipped to guide you in either one of those directions. And so I was able to find a new advisor, thankfully, who was already in our department. I didn't have to like leave and transfer or anything like that, because there's definitely some instances where I think some people, they don't get the academic support, or there just isn't someone in their department at their university that is able to help them and give them the guidance that they need to do a project like this. But I got very lucky that I had a very supportive faculty behind me throughout the whole process. But I've went into this project being like, I want to study psychedelics, and it took a lot of time to kind of narrow down what I was going to study, but there was a whole kind of chain of events that happened. But yeah, I guess that's the big overall picture of where I came from and where I'm at now, to an extent.
Beautiful. What a brilliant intro. I'd love to hear about the PhD that you didn't do about space colonization and, building a colony on Mars. And it's interesting because we've been talking quite a bit. Kyle, who's one of the founders here, he's spoken a lot about the similarities between the psychedelic journey of kind of going out to this great unknown and coming back as a changed being to, the planet where we were born. And that is, a great parable and an analogy to the psychedelic journey. Like, we're going out into this unknown space. But the idea of colonizing there, it's almost like, you meet a DMT entity and you kind of just stay there a little bit. What were some of the things that were bringing you to want to, look into that and learn about colonizing space?
That's a good question. I think part of it was my PhD journey started, I guess, 5 years ago now. And around that time, like, we really started seeing like SpaceX doing more launches and becoming more of like a household kind of name in a way, right? And of course, like Elon Musk with that. And I was like, wow, it's been so long since we've seen space exploration, and we're seeing really this whole new frontier of what it can be and what the potential is for it. And I was like, well, if we really do set on another planet, like, anthropologists are so important to that. What does that look like? How do we conduct ourselves as human beings? What does culture look like? How do we organize ourselves? And what are our politics? What are ethics? How is it similar or different to how we function here on Earth? And like all of these kind of different compositional pieces of it. And I think kind of what you bring up too, it does mirror and parallel some of the experiences that I was having psychedelically, of like literally kind of like leaving this reality, this existence, and traveling and exploring new other kind of worlds in my psyche. And, I think in a more kind of tangible reality, like, it was kind of that same idea of just being interested in what's out there and how does that look for the future.
It's really interesting to think about, and with psychedelics, we can often think about like this new paradigm and how it's going to change the world and change reality. And, and some people think the same thing about building a colony on Mars. Like, okay, let's start again because we fucked up Earth. let's go someplace else and try again. It's like, when I think, there's a lot of room for exploring with psychedelics, the shadow, like you were saying, from your own PTSD and anxiety, and using psychedelics to really heal that piece inside. I think, let's heal our Earth. And I loved what you said you were doing, I think, in your master's degree, Gabby, about kind of doing community environmental impact assessments. I've done a bit of that in the past as well. It's really interesting. Like, on one side, it gives us jobs. On the other side, our laundry's dirty and we can't breathe, and my kids are sick. So how do we reconcile that? And there's something psychedelic about that too. Like, when we go into a journey, we see the good and the bad and the really challenging and the confusing, and that they are all true. They're all part of us. So how do we kind of carve a way through that?
Yeah, for sure. There's so much there. And I never realized like how psychedelic all of the work has been that I've done. Um, And actually, and when I think about it too, when it comes to like exploring like the project that I wanted to do with like the space colonization, um, something that really comes up, I think, in some of those conversations too, is accessibility. Like who would go to Mars if we go and colonize it? And I think that parallels with access to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy of who has access to that, right? Right now, we don't really have insurance companies that are interested in accepting, insurance claims to help patients pay for it. And they're trying to figure out what model works for that and what it can look like. So there's this big question of accessibility on kind of both sides of that issue. But yeah, there's so much there to think about.
That's amazing. Yeah, like who's going to get on those rockets? It's going to be the rich people.
Yeah,
maybe
it's not going to be me.
maybe a few mechanics and a doctor. Yeah, and who's going to get access to MDMA assisted treatment that's $15,000-$20,000?
Yeah,
who's going to afford that?
Yeah.
Let's talk about psychedelic grad. So you very kindly had me on your podcast, and I really love what psychedelic grad does. And we get a lot of requests saying, how do I find out more about jobs, about finding people that live in my country or my state, and we direct them to our groups, but also to Psychedelic Grad because you're a great meeting place. So yeah, we've been sending people your way, and we really love what you do. And thanks for having me on your podcast, Curious to Serious. I was wondering, why isn't that called Serious to Curious? And was that a debate? Because I'm thinking, I think we're moving from being serious to curious, but I guess we're moving as well from being curious to more serious once we find our calling and our path in psychedelics. But just a thought there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought about switching it around. I guess because so many of us on our journeys, we were just curious about, we found our way somehow curiously to psychedelics. And then we were like, we get so passionate about doing something with it, right? But I suppose it has the potential to go the other way too, huh?
Yeah, but I like how you're saying as well, like we find something from that curiosity. It's like, and it's hard to deny it from that point on. It's like, oh, wow. Okay, I guess this is what I need to do, or this is what I need to work on, or think about it a little bit deeper. So what was the idea of Psychedelic Grad? Like, how did it come into being? What does it do? What's its kind of mission, if you want to tell folks all about it?
Yeah. So Psychedelic Grad started as kind of this thought. What was going on is you can join the MAPS graduate student listserv, right? So you get like emails in your inbox of like people sending out, job prospects, internships, those kinds of things. But it really feels like a piecemeal, disconnected kind of conversation going on. So at Psychedelic Grad, we were like, how do we bring people to a central hub? And it's like, even though you were part of like the MAPS student listserv, you only get a piece of it. You still have to go to all these other websites to find jobs or find what research is out there or find academic programs, find mentors, that kind of thing. So we were like, how do we create this central hub where it's kind of like your one-stop shop of all psychedelic resources if you're trying to get into the professional realm of it? And that's really where it started from. And it started shortly before COVID. Like we started setting it up 2019, 2020, right as the pandemic kind of started, right? So it was a good time to start an online community, right? Because we were all stuck inside anyway. It's not like we can meet in person, which kind of helped us grow our base from the beginning. And a lot of the things kind of grew out of that. But our central mission is really, it's kind of an academic education knowledge kind of focus where we want to provide resources to people. We want to be that link between those who are curious and those who want to find their way to being serious, essentially, right? If we want to bring that metaphor back in. So we provide those links between the professionals in the field and those students are those, you don't even have to be a student, any individual who is just trying to find their way, right? Because something that has come up on a lot of the podcast episodes that I've done for Psychedelic Grad has been that you don't have to have formal education necessarily to do work in this field. There's a lot of other ways to gain knowledge, to gain experience. There are other certificates that aren't formal, 4-year degrees or PhDs or anything like that. And something else I mentioned too, that when I recorded with you before, for the Vital program, is that there's so many other jobs that are popping up in the psychedelic field that people just don't know. They don't see that they can be connected to the psychedelic field. So you can be someone who does medical coding and billing, right? That's something we're going to need in the psychedelic field. You're just kind of transitioning to another focus within the medical field. We need people to design websites. We need people to write commercials and advertisements and, those types of things. We have all these different jobs that are coming up. So Psychedelic Grad is kind of the hub for making those connections so people can see where they fit into the space. That's our ultimate goal. And we do that in a number of ways. We have our online community platform. We have the podcast Curious to Serious, where we explore people's journeys and, what lessons they learned, what mentors they had, what things went well, what things, were really challenging for them, formal education, non-formal education, all those different things. How they found jobs, every step of the process. We've even talked to students that are just like, how do you find a lab that you want to study in? How do you make a psychedelic focus out of something without psychedelic experience, or psychedelic related training? So there's the podcast. We have our weekly newsletter that has current research that's going on. We have, we advertise our podcast in there too. We have important links on legislation that's coming out. We usually try to cover the United States, but we also cover, we had a few links in there from Australia and the UK. We try to cover the globe just because we are a global community. Internships, job opportunities, what other stuff? Education opportunities, all kinds of stuff in there. So we have our newsletter, and then we have community meetings online. With COVID, they've kind of gone down a little bit because people are so interested in meeting in person now. But we do have community meetings where people can connect and meet other people, learn about mentors, all kinds of things. So we're just kind of this central hub of bringing people together as they find their way through the psychedelic world.
Thank you for doing that. It's super important. It really is, just to have a place to go to ask questions, like especially about things that are a bit complicated and a little bit illegal as well in many places. So who do you ask? Where do you feel safe to put that out? And yeah, thanks for doing that. It's really important. And we had a student actually that joined Vital that asked a question on Psychedelic Grad. Where can I find a good program, for like a 12-month course? And I'm not a clinician. And she's actually just completed Vital. Her name's Paloma David. And she's now actually just been accepted to do a Ph.D. herself at Nijmegen University in Holland in ayahuasca-related study.
Oh my gosh,
so that was all
wonderful.
Just from a Psychedelic Grad, little kind of chat comment, like asking a question, and one thing led to another. So yeah, it's great to have somewhere to go with questions, isn't it?
That's so awesome. Those are the success stories that we really love to hear. That's totally 100% what we are here for. That was our goal, and that's so awesome to hear that we're meeting our goal. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's awesome. And maybe just to say, like, when you take a step back and try and join the dots together of what you're noticing people are asking on Psychedelic Grad, what is it that is coming to the surface? So what are you seeing people need to know more about, or there's a gap that you're filling? And what kind of shared experiences do people have in relation to wanting to have a job in psychedelics? Why do they want a job? What kind of job? What are they afraid might happen? What roadblocks are they encountering? Anything there that you're noticing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'd say people are really most interested in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy side of things, just in general, which is important, right? I think something that psychedelics today brings up a lot is this bottleneck that we have and that we're gonna see, is that even when things become legal, or there are kind of frameworks in place for practicing psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, like we're going to have a shortage of individuals who are trained to do that. Which is important that we're bringing in people that are interested in that. The hard thing is like finding them. There's no like standard of like what that will look like or should look like. And I just had Hadass Alterman on our podcast last month, and she does some really amazing work, but she's doing some work where they are creating like a standard. They're trying to create a standard of kind of education so that there can be an across the board like accreditation for getting like training in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, right? That way, if you go to Stanford or if you go to CIAS or if you go to somewhere else, like it doesn't matter where you go, you can get like an accredited program to be able to do that work. But I feel like there's a lot of people that are kind of drifting in this space trying to figure out, how do I get training in the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy that can be applied later? How do I find an internship that allows me to explore that kind of interest while giving me the basic kind of training and experience in therapy or counseling, that kind of thing. But I'd say those are like, that's definitely the biggest interest right now that we see, is the psychedelic assisted psychotherapy kind of track, which is really important. For me, I think it's obviously really important. I really would like to see more people, and I really encourage more people to think about what, maybe if they're already trained, maybe they're in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and they want to transition to a psychedelic career, think about what you're already trained in and come to Psychedelic Grad and help us, let us help you kind of figure out where you might be able to see yourself in the psychedelic space, because you might be able to use your web designing skills, or you might be able to use, whatever experience you have in the medical field, and people to help companies that already exist, but just transition into the psychedelic world too. So personally, that's something I want to see a little bit more of. But I also recognize like there's just this huge interest in the therapy side of things, which is really important, because that's how we get everything legal. That's how we can create structure for people to get access to treatment in terms of like the clinical side of things. Of course, my research speaks outside the box on that a little bit, but which I'm sure we'll get to then. But that's how we kind of get the legal. That's how we get like the bureaucratic, the government on the side of things, and the medical insurance companies and all of that too. That's kind of how we get the ball rolling.
100%. Awesome. I think it's time, Gabby.
Yay!
Let's talk about your PhD. So you had that conundrum whether to talk about space colonization, but you didn't do that. So what did you do your PhD on? Just tell folks like what was the thesis, the title, and some of the reasons why you chose that.
Yeah. So the overall, I'll give the shortened title because the long title has a lot of like theory jargon in it. But the overall title is, I studied transformative psychedelic experiences at music events, which is very unique in itself. Not a lot of people are studying it. And I chose to study that for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is like personal experience. As I was taking psychedelics, I started taking them at different types of music events. And then I had this period where I managed to wean myself off of SSRIs. And I realized, and at the time when I did that, there wasn't a lot of research going on understanding how psychedelics interact with SSRIs in the brain, and how coming off of SSRIs can change how psychedelics interact in the brain. And we're still not seeing an exceptional amount of research on that, right? Because there's so much to understand about the brain, way more than I can even speak to, right? Because I'm definitely not a neuroscientist, I'm an anthropologist. But it was interesting because in my experience, I realized that as I stopped taking the SSRIs, my psychedelic experiences started becoming incredibly more intense, like way more intense. And I was at a small festival. It was kind of a festival, but I was at this like small kind of like, I would call it a multi-day show because there wasn't like camping there. We can get into the semantics of what constitutes each type of event, but, yeah. But it was, and I was there and I took some acid and it just got really intense and I couldn't understand why. And I was like trying to explain to like my boyfriend, I was like, something doesn't feel right. Like something's wrong. Like, why am I freaking out? Why does this not feel like it normally does? And I was just like, I had a really hard, uncomfortable, and for quite a bit of time, really unenjoyable kind of moment. It finally settled down like later into the evening, but it was really hard and it scared me away from taking psychedelics in that setting for a long time. So part of it was I got this curiosity of like, how do people take psychedelics in this setting? Like, how do they make it work? When they have these moments like this where they're just like, I never want to do this again. How do they keep wanting to do it, right? What keeps pushing them to do it? So there was a sense of curiosity in that way. So it's kind of a self-exploration of like, how can I still use how can I use psychedelics in that setting and get benefit out of them without like freaking myself out, basically. So that was a part of it. Another part of it was there's a lot of clinical research going on, which, as I've mentioned, is super important. It's how we kind of get the legal side of things going. But I can be somewhat frustrated sometimes when from the clinical setting, there's this idea that recreational use has no benefit for people. Because I've seen it from other people's experiences. There have been experiences that I've had in those types of recreational settings that have been incredibly beneficial for me. Even when I started taking psychedelics, even though I was taking them at home, it wasn't clinical, it wasn't medical, it wasn't necessarily like therapeutic as defined by therapeutic, right? Air quotes there. So it was still considered recreational. So I was just really frustrated in seeing kind of repeated notions that recreational isn't necessarily beneficial. And so I set out to be like, well, if it's not beneficial, then maybe we should go check it out and see what's really going on. And then another part of it is I went to a festival and I met Emmanuel Safiros and I had a conversation with him. I was like, yeah, I'm really interested in studying psychedelics in a recreational setting, but I don't know what to study. So I brought up this question to him. I was like, you have a pulse on what's going on in the research world. What do you think needs to be done? What research do you think needs to be done? And he literally like just turned around and was like, this right here. We're in this music festival and people are taking psychedelics and there's all kinds of things going on. He's like, but no one's really looking at it. No one's seeing what people's experiences are and what they mean to them. And I was like, this is it. This is the golden goose, right? I was like, this is what I need to study, because he was right. There's not a lot of people studying that. There's a few studies that look at recreational psychedelic use, a few in, festival settings. Hillary Agro did a master's thesis research on it. And there's a few other, I want to say his name, Cameron Duff has done a little bit of research looking at like the pleasure of psychedelic use within music festival settings. But it's just a small handful. It's nothing like we're seeing the clinical side pumping out articles on this kind of stuff. So that's really what led me to studying this type of psychedelic use in that context. That's a long-winded answer.
That was brilliant. I guess one question is, you wanted to look at the recreational aspect of using psychedelics, as a counterweight to the obsessive focus on the clinical or scientific, the sanitized version of it, the real world stuff, like people that are using it now. And I love that story of that person that was like, do this, Gabby, like this festival, this music. You came up with this idea of the transformational impact. What does that mean? How do you measure it, like technically speaking? And yeah, that really speaks to a different way of measuring outcomes to, say, a trauma, a depression, addiction survey, and screening tool. So why and how transformational impact, and how do you measure that?
This is such a great question. When I did my defense, this is like almost the exact same question that I got. So I'm prepared for this one. So I chose transformation because there's a lot of clinical studies looking at mystical, which is great, right? But I was like, what does mystical mean? Is that I felt like that was a really particular kind of meaningful experience, right? So I was like, maybe I can broaden that, because I don't really know what mystical exactly means. So I was like, what does transformation mean, right? Because I could go to someone and say, did you have a mystical experience? And they might not really even know what defines a mystical experience, which we can argue that what does transformation mean? So I went into the study, kind of framing things as an exploratory study, being kind of trying to figure out what does transformation mean, which of course, when you go to a Ph.D. committee and say, I don't really know what transformation means, and they're like, why are you doing this project? They get a little confused. But I basically had this general idea of like transformation means change. Like that was like when a participant would ask me, what do you mean by transformation? The first thing I would say is, if you think an experience is transformational to you, then it's transformational. Because who am I to say that your experience wasn't transformational? I didn't experience it, right? So I really left that open to participants to define if their experience was transformational. That's like very subjective. If they ask for a definition, I would kind of just expand a little bit and say, something that created meaning for you or created change for you, right? Because when we think of transformation in general, you think of change. So I collected a couple of different types of data. I did like participant observation, I did interviews, and then I did a survey. So in the interviews, I would ask participants, what made this experience transformational for you? And that was really helpful to it helped me kind of group themes of what transformation can be, right? So I saw things like people overcoming drug addiction. I saw people changing careers and jobs. I found people overcoming, challenging mental health issues, things like depression, anxiety, finding purpose in life, developing empathy for themselves, developing empathy for other people, that kind of thing, changing ideas around religion and spirituality. Those were all kind of themes of what transformation popped up as. And then I also used kind of their definitions to kind of determine what are the overarching kind of patterns of how people are defining transformation. And I found kind of two pieces to that. The first one being people would talk about having a change, like an internal change, whether that be internal thoughts or internal emotions or internal feelings. There was something that happened during the experience that changed something internally. And then the second part of the transformation had to be some type of outward expression of that change, right? So it could be a behavioral action, like eating healthier. It could be going back to school and changing their career. But it had to be kind of this connection between the internal and the external. There's internal processes that then result in some type of external change, usually like in everyday life, right? So that's kind of how participants ended up defining transformation. I really left it open as a kind of exploratory piece of the study. And then, although transformation, I kind of went in with the idea that transformation doesn't equal mystical. But I included the mystical experience questionnaire in my survey because I wanted to see, like, are people having mystical experiences and does it equate to transformation? And what I found is that it didn't. Most of my participants did not score as having a mystical experience, but the experience was still meaningful for them and it still created meaningful long-term change for them. So it says something about mystical experiences being very particular kind of experience. It also says something about how we can measure different types of experiences in different contexts, right? So maybe the mystical experience questionnaire, we could take pieces from it and use it in kind of studying mystical experiences in recreational settings. But we can also need to think about these contextual pieces that go into those experiences too, and think about how can we alter the mystical experience questionnaire to capture how these experiences happen in kind of everyday life and everyday settings.
Amazing. Yeah, and I really appreciate the connection between internal experiences and external kind of manifestations and changes. And I think that's where a lot of where the questions are in psychedelics now is, okay, great, you had an amazing trip and, you have God consciousness and you kind of sucked on a lollipop that, is made up of all these rainbow flavors in this cosmos. And now now you're back to your job stacking shelves or, changing a dirty diaper. All right. So what changed about that? What do you feel like you learned around what makes a good festival from the perspective of transformation? So say you were going to consult with a festival organizer, like, I want to have the most transformational psychedelic festival for people so that when they come here, they're really going to have XYZ kinds of experiences. So in a sense, like, what are some of the variables that they would want to work on? And then what would they design? Like, what would that look like to actually produce a festival to satisfy those variables? Is that an okay question to ask?
Oh, that's a wonderful question to ask.
All right.
No, this is a fun question to ask. And it's interesting because in a way, it's kind of what my advisor asked me to kind of think about when I was trying to like write the final like discussion chapter of my dissertation. Cause I was like, I don't know how to write this. And he's like, what are the pieces? What are the pieces of the puzzle that make these experiences? And how is it specific to festivals? Right. And And I want to put a quick caveat in here. The title of the dissertation includes music events. And I did study like single day events. I studied multi-day music festivals without camping, multi-day music festivals with camping. You know, I kind of ran the gamut of it, but a lot of it focused on music festivals. So when I use that term, it's all encompassing of music events, really, but I might use it as music festival. But yeah, what are kind of like the pieces, right? What are those essential pieces? In the survey, I had participants rank the top 3 factors that contributed to their experience. And this is super interesting, right? Because even the participants who did not have a mystical experience, they ranked connection to the universe and ego disillusion as their top 2 like ranking factors. So that again speaks to mystical doesn't equal transformation, but there's still mystical aspects to it, right? And then the third rated factor was the music, which is interesting because when we think about the clinical setting, like, you know, when we look at like the MAPS protocol and everything, like music is a part of it. But in the interviews, people talked about the value of live music. Like there's something special and something unique about music being created in the moment. And you as a spectator are part of the creation of that music. And there's something really special going on there. So I definitely say it's the music, and it's not just the music as the music. It's this kind of live production of the music. There's some type of magic in it, right? And that may, you know, call for a whole nother study of what is the magic of live music, but you know, that's definitely like a piece of it. Another kind of piece of it is a lot of people talk about art, right? And it's not just like everyday art. It's not like just going to a museum kind of art. You know, the way that artists and event organizers create these types of spaces, they create, and a lot of people talk about it like this, these kind of otherworldly environments. They're not places that we're going to encounter, you know, on our way to work or in our office, in our job or something like that. You know, it's the only place you might encounter in everyday life is if you go to like Meow Wolf or something, right? They're very unique, kind of crafted, otherworldly spaces. It's kind of like going to Mars in a way, right? And you're going to this other kind of planet. And that's really essential because in creating these other spaces, it allows people to, like, how do I explain this without like getting too jargony in the literature? But like in anthropology, we talk a lot about like liminality and how that can create change for people. So when people they leave kind of one space and they enter into a different kind of space, it creates a liminal world for them. So people leave their everyday work, they leave their everyday kind of responsibilities of taking kids to soccer practice or, you know, running errands, those kinds of things. And they enter into this whole nother world where their responsibilities like that don't impede them from being able to kind of explore themselves. So they enter into this liminal space that is crafted and often features like space kind of features. Like space is a really big piece of festival art, right? So they enter into this kind of crafted otherworldly space, and that can create liminality. And then on top of it, with taking a psychedelic, they experience liminality of the mind too, right? Because they're kind of leaving their everyday functioning of the brain. The default mode network turns down, and it allows them to experience this altered state of consciousness, which is another kind of world, but it's another mental world. So you have this physical and this mental liminality that allows people to drop their barriers that typically keep them functioning in their everyday lives of being like, okay, got to check off the list, got to go to the grocery store, got to pick up the dog from the vet, you know, those kinds of things. And allows them to explore social and cultural and personal constructs that they don't typically get the ability to do. So I would say when it comes to the festival environment, music is a big part of it. Art and creating that kind of otherworldly space is a large part of it. And then the third part of it is community. And that's huge. People talked about community. I would say it's a staple of a lot of people's experiences. Community throughout the entire process. And that means like before they even decide to take a psychedelic, maybe they're talking to their friends and like, oh, you're taking acid tonight. I've never taken it. How much do you take? What's it like? What can I expect from the experience? That kind of thing. It can be community in the experience where, they're having a great time and they just feel really connected to the people around them. They feel connected to every single person in that entire space, even if they've never met them before, right? Or even if they're having a challenging experience and they turn to, people talked to strangers and they were just like, I'm lost right now and I just need someone to talk to. And like, people are there for you. There's a supportive community there. And then after the experience too, community members come together in a variety of ways. Like some people talked about, late at night after the main music is over, they go back and they hang out at their campsite and their friends play some music and they sit around a campfire and they just talk about their experience, be like, yo, you're never going to believe what I experienced today. Like, I thought about this and I thought about that and I thought about my future and I thought about my past and I don't know what I'm going to do. And they sit there and they process all of these things. Other people go home, they talk to like a sibling or a family member, and they function as community too. So I'd really say, like, at least from my study, like 3 of the big pieces are really the community is huge. The music was a big part of it, that live music, and then just crafting these liminal spaces in a way that match the liminal kind of mental spaces that psychedelics create too.
I really appreciate hearing this word liminality. It's cool. We don't hear that too much in psychedelic science, as far as I'm aware of anyway. And another word I thought was absorption. And yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't necessarily have to have a mystical, spiritual, religious perspective. But what were some of the feelings that people had, particularly at music events, that were spiritual or mystical, that were maybe on that interpersonal level of connecting with others, that are maybe the ones that are really hard to put words to? Like, how did people put words to that feeling? Literally, like, what words did they use when they were like, it's, when, and how do they, what were some of the samples of what the participants said? And how many participants were there, just as an aside?
Yeah, we'll start with the number there first. In terms of interviews, I interviewed 38 people. And those were like narrative interviews. So I was like, tell me about your experience, and some of those, they ranged from 45 minutes to literally 4 hours long. So, so I got, and I asked people to share other experiences too, just because that was another thing. Like I kind of functioned as this kind of community member in the way that it provided an opportunity for people to sit down and process and think about their experience, and kind of work through things and learn new things that maybe they didn't see before. But so yeah, 38 interview participants, and then I had 523 survey respondents.
Oh, wow. That's quite a lot of data.
Yeah.
Far out. So I'd love to know what that person spoke about for 4 hours. That must have been a far out trip. But yeah, what were some of the ways that people expressed, their experiences from the music events that were of that more kind of liminal, spiritual, particularly around that feeling part of the community?
Yeah, it's interesting because we speak about these experiences often being ineffable. We can't describe them with words. We're limited by our human vocabulary in a way. But people really found a way somehow, with it being ineffable, to speak to these things in almost a very similar way. They talked about literally like connectedness, feeling one, like, these kind of big terms that we hear in other studies too. Like they talk about oneness. They talk about connectedness. They talk about connectedness to everyone else around them. They talk about being connected to something higher than themselves even. They talk about being connected to the space around them. There was one person who talked about just feeling connected to the oak trees. Like it was like, when the wind blew through them, she felt like she was breathing through them, that kind of thing. People find really creative ways to speak to these things, but ultimately, like, it still functions around these kind of phrases and terms that we hear in other studies, which is so interesting that somehow we still find a way to describe them in a similar way, despite the fact that they're ineffable, which is just so interesting. But really just connectedness and oneness. And I even got terms like duality, right? Or non-duality, that kind of feel, those kinds of terms.
Far out. And the festivals and music events you went to, where were they? Like, for example, was it Lightning in a Bottle, Burning Man? What kinds of places are we talking about here?
Great question. So, dream big, kids. I got to say that. My goal was to really try to go out to a lot of other states. I really would have loved to go to Burning Man, because it is, in my experience with talking to people who have been to Burning Man, it's not really classified as a music festival. It's really like this kind of arts and lifestyle festival, which really would have been an interesting comparative experience compared to some of the other stuff that I did go to. And I would have liked to go a little bit more out of state, but I typically stayed in, I'm thinking of geography here, southeast, right? Florida's in the southeast. Definitely not a geographer. But it's southeast United States for the most part, mostly in Florida. I went up to Atlanta, Georgia for a show. But most of it was really in the Florida area. I did a lot of like more of like the single day shows were like Tampa, Tampa area. And then music festivals, I kind of traveled all around Florida for the most part. It's hard to travel when you don't get grant funding for research, but it's also really hard to get research to do recreational drug research.
Yeah. And did you have to get permission from all of the organizers of the events to do your work?
So I contemplated that for a long time, because there's a bit of a catch-22 with it. And what that is if you go to an event organizer and you say, hey, I'm doing this research, then they are knowledgeable that people are using drugs at their event, right? And then that has the potential to be used as evidence against them under the RAVE Act, right? And no one wants to deal with that. So I kind of went about it with this perspective of it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. And honestly, like I didn't have any problems. I didn't have event organizers coming up to me saying like, what are you doing? I was also really, I don't want to say smart, but like I was really like, I try to like play it out in my head, right? The way that festivals are typically set up is like you have your camping area like around the outside or like separate. And then you have like your festival grounds, that are separate, and you have to go through security to get through there, right? So I did a lot of my work on the outskirts, like in the campground area, because they're not really paying attention to what's really going on there. Whereas like if I was in the like festival area, I wouldn't go out and just be handing out my research flyers, talking to people about it. If I came up and I had a conversation with someone and I was like, oh, I think you'd be interested in it, then I would give them a flyer. But I wouldn't just stand there and hand out flyers, because I didn't want to bring that kind of attention to it. Two, I didn't want event organizers to be like, what are you doing? And then risk like, not being allowed into the festival anymore. That, and it's kind of like once I was in the festival area, like that's when I really did like more of the participant observation, where I was just like, what are people doing? How are people dancing? What kind of flow arts are they doing? What kind of art is around? And just having more informal conversations with people. But yeah, that's kind of how I took an approach to it. Although I had someone help me hand out flyers. They were going to like EDC in Orlando, and they were like, hey, I can take some flyers and hand them out for you. And I was like, yeah, that's a great idea, because that's a place that I'm not going to go. So it covers more ground. And it is not this person's fault. I should have known that. I should have like gave them some direction and pointers on how to not get in trouble. But this person was handing out flyers like literally right in front of the security or right after the security checkpoint in EDC. And of course, like someone comes up to him and like grabs the flyers and like cuts his wristband off and tells him he's not allowed in. And like it was the only day he went, and he didn't even get to go in and see any of the music. And I felt so guilty. And I was like, okay, this is a lesson that you definitely, like anyone who's willing to help you with research, just give them guidance, give them a little bit of, even it's informal kind of training. Especially when you're doing like work that is dealing with kind of illicit substances, right? You want to make sure that people are safe, or if, how to handle those types of situations. Cause like, it probably would have been better if he was like out in the parking lot handing out flyers. They wouldn't have even known, he wouldn't have been on their radar, that kind of thing. So yeah, that was a lesson learned.
There's a lot of similarities between that lesson learned and harm reduction services wanting to be in these festivals, offering testing services so folks can freely test their drug supply and see what's in it and if it's safe to use. And that probably obviously saves lives, but I would suggest also impacts the experiences of the trip. And we did a webinar, I think, about 8 months ago with Pini Baumal, a social worker in Israel, and he was one of the authors on a paper. I've got it here. Let's see. It's called "Substance Use, Harm Reduction, Attitudes and Behavior Among Attendees of Nature Rave Parties in Israel," and it measured a few different variables. I can't remember all of the details, but one of them was around testing and the extent to which you knew what you were taking, had it been tested, and to what extent that is important to you. Like, would you like to know what is in it? And does knowing what is in that affects your decisions about how much you take or what you combine together, or who you are with? And I think, what was your sense of harm reduction services, of the need, the desire for that, and the impact of whether or not they were available on people's transformational experiences?
That's a really good question. I was really shocked when because I did include a question on the survey that said about like, how often do you test your psychedelics before taking them? And it was really polarized. Either people tested them pretty much all the time or they didn't test them at all. There wasn't much middle ground in there, which from my perspective, like, I'm like, oh no, you should be testing them every time, right? And it was kind of across the board when I would talk to people. But I would say probably most people didn't typically test their substances. A lot of what I would hear is, "Oh, I know the person that I bought it from. I bought from them before. I trust them." There were some individuals that I talked to, kind of like under the radar that, were selling, and, they go around and they tell people, they're like, "Even though I tested it, I tell people to test it anyway." And people will just be like, "Oh, it's okay, you tested it." And that person would be like, "No, like, I tested it, but that doesn't mean you should trust me. You need to still test it yourself." Right. So we're still seeing that, like, and I would say there's even maybe there's an age thing here too. Or maybe not, now that I think about it, because I definitely think some of the maybe like 40s, late 30s and 40s and above, they just aren't, some of them just really aren't interested in testing their substances. And then it's also kind of polarizing because I feel like some of the younger ones, like 18 to 20, like they're just like, "Oh, I'm just going to take it. Whatever happens, happens," And then more in the middle, some of those middle ages between like 20 to mid and late 30s, like they're the ones that are kind of a little bit more interested in testing their substances. So it's interesting that there's a little bit of an age thing in there. But even if people weren't testing their substances, they still were using harm reduction. Like they would go to the dance safe tent, right? Even if it was just for earplugs, or, if they took MDMA and they're jawing and they need like some gum or candy or something. So it's like, even like harm reduction is so broad, right? Even if they're not necessarily using the testing services, like there's still like other services that they're using. They'll still go up and get the information card and read it, or they'll ask questions about what drugs to take together. And a lot of times when I would go to the dance safe tent, if they were like testing at that festival that I was at, like there would be a line. People would be waiting to get their substances tested. So there's definitely still a demand, even if people, say that they're not interested, or, and I think part of it is if people, the organization of a festival matters, right? Because there's one festival, there's a place that I go for festivals constantly, and they don't have security. They don't pull your car apart and look for anything. They just kind of let you in, have a good time, whereas another festival that I went to, there were police, there were canine dogs, there was an amnesty box that when you drove in, and it was ridiculous, it was the size of like a shoebox. I was like, yeah, people were really giving up all of their drugs that they're coming in with. You're going to need bigger than a shoebox, right? But like, so there's kind of different levels of security, and that really plays, I think, a part in how people decide what drugs to bring and how much. Because I can see people who can just kind of drive right in without a problem, like they're going to have maybe a supply that they've known, that they've taken at home. They know what to expect with it, right? They don't, maybe they have tested it before, or they don't feel necessarily like they need to because they took it at home. They know how much to take to get a certain effect that they're looking for. Whereas in the situations where people are being searched really hard, I mean, like that festival, they were pulling people's coolers out of the back of their car. They're pulling their luggage out and, sorting through their clothing. In those instances, people are more nervous to do that. So they won't bring anything in. And then they're more likely to buy from someone who's selling in the campsite area. And what's interesting about that festival too is there was no harm reduction services. Dance Safe was not there. Bunk Police wasn't there. No one was there. So people are less likely to bring in substances that they already have, that they may have already tested or that they know what to expect from. And then they're buying from someone that they likely don't know. And there's no one there to test it, right? There's no, organization there to help them test it or, ask questions and those types of things. So it's interesting to see all of these, when I talk about context, like context really matters. Context matters in the way that festivals are organized, even through the security that they offer and how that impacts harm reduction and people's experiences. So there's just so much there in the context too, and how that plays into it, and harm reduction practices and what people do, and just so much in there.
Yeah, there's huge pieces there around policy as well, I think, is how these are policed, but also, the policy of drugs being illegal and that the enforcement of that illegality leads to harm and risk. And people think, all right, I'll leave my safe supply at home. I'll just find a plug there and just take whatever they got, and there's no one to test it, and I can't talk to them about it. And it's funny that, like, at the front of the door of those festivals, they've got a shoebox to amnesty, whereas at some other places, like at the Dance Safe, there's lines and lines of people lining up to have it tested. So that just shows a real asymmetry there in expectations between different groups of people. What were some of the things you pulled out of this as an anthropologist about human behavior and decision making? Like, what's on that anthropological level? Where did you go with it?
Oh my gosh. It's wild, because trying to write a dissertation and what you feel like is enough time, and then you kind of realize it isn't enough time. You kind of have to pick and choose what you have time to analyze. So I feel like the things that I came out of it, there's so much more. And I plan on analyzing more of the survey data and kind of looking at things that didn't work out to see if there's other analyses that I can do to see what kind of maybe does come out. Anthropologically, some of the things to kind of pull out of it are some of the things maybe that I already said, but I'll kind of bring it into this overarching thing too. But definitely, like, community makes a big difference in people's experiences. It makes a difference in how people take psychedelics, right? And I saw that in the way that people talk to each other. Like, they show up to a festival and they're like, oh, what are you interested in taking throughout the festival? And they would be like, oh, so-and-so is playing this night, so I'm going to take some Molly, but I want to see so-and-so on this day, and it's during the day, so I'm going to take some acid, and then later that night, I'm going to take some mushrooms, and then people will be like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. I was thinking of taking this instead, but I think I'm going to do that, right? So community plays a role in not just the experience, but also how people plan out their experience. That's huge. I think another piece of it too, that this context, this recreational use of psychedelics at music festivals, it matters, and it creates meaningful experiences for people. And I won't deny, like, people did talk to me about challenging and straight up terrifying experiences. Like, we will not deny that happens, right? But people also talk about something that we see in clinical studies of sometimes, like, they learn so much from challenging experiences, right? So that there's nothing really different in that way. That there is something that comes out of challenging experiences sometimes, as painful, as terrifying as they can be, they learn something from it. And I think something that kind of appeared to me too was that there are parallels between kind of recreational psychedelic use within this context and the models that are being created for therapeutic practices of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. And granted, my research is not a comparative study of recreational against clinical, right? I would have had to have a whole other study designed to make that happen. But, with reading the MAPS protocol and with I didn't have like clinical trial or anything like experience with it, but in using the MAPS protocol in my own experience at home and kind of like blindfold music, MAPS playlist and everything, and then experiencing some of the things that I did and listening to other people's experiences in that recreational context of music festivals, like there very much are parallels. And it's odd because you wouldn't think, no one's going around a music festival wearing a blindfold with headphones, listening to a MAPS playlist,
Yeah.
right? But the parallels are there in the way that the mechanisms or the processes. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So when you think about the MAPS protocol, it starts by someone taking they're given the medicine and they take the dose, they put the blindfold on, they put the headphones on, they lay back, and they kind of go into this introspective experience for, a while, an hour and 15 minutes, in the same way that can happen for people at music festivals too, right? They'll take, whatever psychedelic that they're on, and there might be a point in time where they're kind of, isolation isn't the word, but they become introspective. Maybe they're standing in front of the stage and, they just get so absorbed, right? We brought up absorption either, but they get so entranced in the music or in the dance and the way that they feel, and they start experiencing the psychedelic, and it gives them this moment to go inward, to be introspective. And they get to think through sometimes things that they otherwise couldn't think about. Again, they're in that liminal headspace, in this liminal kind of environment in the music festival. So they can contemplate like an emotional breakup, a relationship breakup that's been bugging them for months, and they can't figure out how to get over it. They can contemplate like, oh, I'm really unhappy in my life, but I can't figure out why. And they start thinking about it. Or they start, thinking through grief, or recognizing that maybe they have a substance use problem with another drug like cocaine or something like that. And they're like, this is not serving me. They have those introspective moments. And then when we go back to the MAPS protocol, at some point they take the eye shades off, they take the headphones off, and they come out and they talk to their therapist about what they experienced and what's going on. We kind of see a very similar pattern where, in the music festival, an individual can kind of reintegrate back into their social setting, right? They can, maybe they're staying at the stage and they have this realization, and they turn to their friend and they say, hey, I want to talk about this, like this popped up for me. And, them and their friend will go sit off to the side and talk through that. Or maybe, that set is over and they're walking to another stage to go see another artist play, or they're going to go look at the art or go to the vendors or go get food or something. They're kind of reintegrating into this social setting where they're no longer introspective. And in that moment, they get to kind of talk through what they experienced and be like, hey man, like this came up for me and I don't know how to process it. What do you think about it? It gives them that opportunity. And again, that's where community really comes in. They kind of act as that kind of soundboard to bounce ideas off and process things. And throughout the music festival experience, you have these reiterative, introspective, and kind of extrospective. Is that a word? Introspective and
Sure.
kind of external. These introspective and kind of external kind of back and forth, right? In the same way that the MAPS protocol kind of has this introspective and then coming back out and talking to the therapist, going back in, exploring some more, coming back out and talking to the therapist. So we see that, the festival setting may be seen as this recreational, uncontrollable, unstructured environment. And we can't deny that in some ways it is, right? We can't control the temperature. We can't control the type of music. We can't control those things, right? But there are parts of it that are patterned. And in the way that they are patterned, they can provide the opportunity to experience these same kind of patterns that we see in the MAPS protocol, right? And the music festival space is really important for creating that, right? Because like when you're in a music festival, it's not like you're standing in front of the stage the whole time. There are areas that are specifically designed where like if you're feeling like over sensory perception going on, like the music just sounds like too much, the lasers are too much, it's just there's too many people in the crowd. There's spaces where you can go where there aren't people. There are spaces where like there's no music playing, or the music is very soft and it's much more calming and relaxing. So these events are literally crafted in their space and even in the patterns in the way that people do things that can create these kind of patterned experiences that mimic some of what we see in those protocols with the therapy side of things. And so anthropologically speaking, to bring that back together, I think what it shows is that there is the potential for therapeutic benefit from using psychedelics within this particular setting.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Gabby. And yeah, one piece is that this recreational use of psychedelics is important. It's, why? Because people are doing it in huge numbers and they keep doing it, and it's meaningful and transformational. So it's definitely not just the clinical piece that we should be interested in. It's definitely recreational, but also ceremonial. And I think, in a way, recreational might be a nice transition between the ceremonial and the clinical. And I wonder what lessons we could take from things like your study around recreational use that has this group aspect, this communitas, for things like group ketamine therapy, doing the preparation and the integration in a cohort, in a group, and doing an ayahuasca circle or retreat, for a day or 10 days. And the role of music's really interesting. So maybe just before we sign off, I'll share mine. You can share yours next. So for me, I've always loved drum and bass. Like, I'm obsessed with it. I listen to it every single day for like 25 years probably. There's a radio station called bassdrive.com. Anyone who likes drum and bass, go check out. I listened to it for about 25 years, bassdrive.com. They don't pay me anything. But more recently, I've been getting more into deep house. And I really just love melting into deep house. It's so, I could just, when I listen to that, and I don't know musically what the difference is in the BPMs or whatever, I don't know all that stuff, but I know how it makes me feel differently. And I know in Israel, they love trance music, and that is fucking intense. I was like, I can do it for a while, but it's really, really hard. So it's interesting thinking about what music do we like and what helps us, but also it can also challenge us, and we don't want to just listen to stuff that's very pleasant, like on a country walk. We want stuff that's evocative and brings stuff up and really helps us go deep. So what's been some of your personal experiences, Gabby, if it's cool to ask, with types of music and thinking about different sets and setting of what music works, and what some other folks and different festivals have played for people with their music choices?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think part of it is very much exploratory, kind of figuring out what works for you in different ways. For a long time, I got kind of stuck when I was doing kind of this more internal shadow therapeutic work at home. I got stuck listening to a lot of just classical music. I would literally start my trip off listening to the same Beethoven song every single time. And it got to the point where anytime I heard that song, I started getting anxiety because those trips were often filled with a lot of turmoil of me working through stuff. So then you kind of learn it's time to change things up, right? But classical has always kind of been it's interesting because the synesthesia sometimes with it is really fascinating. But it kind of does allow you to go in with, because it doesn't have words necessarily, it allows you to kind of go internal and explore things internally. But there's been other types of music too. I've been a big part of the community that's been supportive for me has been the Deadhead community. So the Grateful Dead and all of their cover bands and their decades worth of fans, I go see a couple of local cover bands here in Tampa that play the Dead, and they're phenomenal. But what's really interesting about the Dead is it's incredibly psychedelic, and a lot of it's really written for psychedelic experiences when they really get into deep jams. And even when there's moments when they're on stage and they feel like they're not really playing anything, and there's this real kind of tension in the music where you're there's no beat, I can't find the beat, and I can't figure out what the sound is, and it's all this really kind of weird kind of things coming together. And if you're tripping or you're, what I mean, it creates that anxiety in you. But at the same time, when it finally all comes together, it feels like this huge wave of just relief, right? Where you're oh, it all comes together, in this really beautiful moment, right? So the Dead for me has been really powerful in that way. And then there's just, even though classical doesn't have music, there's been music that does have lyrics to it, and the Grateful Dead has really been a big part of it for me. Terrapin Station is really, that's been probably my biggest ones, because it's really, everyone, the thing about Dead, like the Grateful Dead too, is like they never really tell you what the meanings of their songs are, because it's really like the meaning that you put into it. So Terrapin Station for me, like I'd heard it a number of times, and then I was like driving back from, I don't know, up north somewhere. And, the studio version came on, and I remember how like just orchestrated it was and how beautiful it was. I was like, this is wonderful. And then I heard it live a couple months later, and I had taken some psychedelics, and it just, the way it hit that time, like I felt it like so deep in my core, and the lyrics just, it was the lyrics just really resonated with me. And for me, it's really about like, overcoming anxiety and overcoming fear and overcoming all of these things that have held me back for so long. Like, and it's wild because I started, our episode here talking about how I ended up studying anthropology because I was too afraid to audition for the music school, right? And here I am, and I use psychedelics to really overcome my anxiety. And Terrapin Station kind of feels like this, the song of like my life, of kind of like overcoming this anxiety. And we all have different ways of overcoming whatever our thing is that's in our way. And Terrapin Station for me kind of speaks to that and my ability to finally overcome that. So that song in particular is big for me. And then, there's a lot of genres of music that I really enjoy. And sometimes it just depends on the substance that I'm on. Sometimes it just depends on how much stuff is going on in my head. As a PhD student, it's really hard to go out and have fun and like turn the switch off when you're like, oh, well, next week I have this meeting with someone, or I have this paper due, or I have to, you know what I mean? So sometimes that plays a big part of it. But I really like all kinds of music. When I was writing my dissertation, I listened to a lot of trance, which I never have been into, but it just kind of helped me get into like that flow state, which was really interesting. Especially with like, if I was microdosing, like, so that microdose with trance was just like it was just a wormhole into productivity for me.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that's really interesting too. But EDM, like, I wasn't a super big fan. It's growing on me more and more, but I like kind of, and I'm not very familiar with all of the genres of EDM. Oh, I'll admit that. But like, things like Tipper and Manic Focus and Closey, these kind of like, they're EDM, but they're still like really chill. Like I really like that. But I also read like jam band. I have to say probably jam band is like my number one. It's just like Twiddle and Grateful Dead and Lettuce. They're all great. And I think they all really kind of are connected. Lettuce and Twiddle kind of are inspired by the Grateful Dead to an extent, where they have these really long jams and they put you in these introspective moments, and then they bring it all together for you in the end. And it's just like this hallelujah moment. Sometimes it's really interesting. And then recently I've been really getting into Billy Strings, the last like 2 or 3 years. And, it's interesting because I think he might technically be classified as country, but like for me, it's like psychedelic kind of rock country in a way, which I never have been a country fan. But I had this moment last year, was the first time I saw him live in St. Augustine. And a few days before that, unfortunately, my aunt had passed away from breast cancer. And, I was at the show, and I'd taken some acid, and I just had this moment where I was so grateful to have her in my life. And it hurt to have her gone, but I also was like, thank God she's not suffering anymore. But it also was like this realization of like, for the last few years, like she hasn't been able to go out and do the things that she's wanted to do. And here I am, like going to see this artist for the first time. And I had this really beautiful moment when he played Away from the Mire, of just recognizing like, just go out and experience life and do it now, because you never know when you're not going to have that opportunity to do that. So that was really instrumental for me. And so that song has a lot of meaning for me, but he's just an incredible picker. The Billy and the boys, they're really incredible all around. But I'd say there's, context is really key. If you want to get down to like the nitty gritty of it, context is key. Different types of music in different settings, and different physical settings, and different mental settings, and different substances. it's all kind of a mixture of figuring out the right recipe that works in the moment for what you're looking for. And then even then, you're not really 100% sure what you're going to get out of it.
Yeah. Do you make any playlists? Because listening to you talking, I kind of want you to, Gabby. Like that could be part of what you offer. Like, do you do that much for yourself or for others?
I definitely do. I mean, when I look at my Spotify, I have a lot of playlists. I've got the dissertation writing playlist.
One for just for journeying with, because I haven't made my own. I just use other people's or just kind of pick and mix a wee bit. But I'm suggesting you should. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think that'd be, because I've been using a lot of like the Maps ones and that whole. But
if you want to make one, then when this comes out, we'll stick it in the show notes.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
You just came up with some awesome suggestions, and you're like, what you're saying is that through the course of the playlist, that it takes you on a journey, and hopefully, comes to some kind of crescendo, and then integrative moment.
Yeah, and you know what? Now that you bring up like that idea of the journey too, if you don't have a playlist picked out, albums from like the 60s and 70s, they were literally created front to back to take you on a journey, right? When you think of Pink Floyd, you start at the beginning and you go all the way through track for track until the end. It tells you a story. And one of my earliest, trips on acid was listening to, Dark Side of the Moon. And I think I did another one where I listened to The Wall, right? And those were journeys. So if you want to take a different journey, you want to try another journey, you don't really know where to go, and there's not a playlist to find, like try like some of those albums from, the 60s and 70s that are, created front to back to kind of be a story to take you on a journey, because, that's one way to do it too.
Final quirky question.
Okay.
So we've got a space colony on Mars, and we're doing a bit of a kind of meet and greet festival with everyone living there. I wonder what kind of music we're going to do and what kind of drugs are we going to have. There we are, kind of, in Mars, looking around in the kind of, it's a bit dusty and red here. Yeah, what music do we want to have? What are we going to dance to out there, with our suits on? Or maybe there's a oxygen pressurized kind of dance floor somewhere. It's interesting to think how, like, the different places where we're at, we want different music and the different people that are there as well. But you could have totally different people there, and still they could learn somehow through the music, I feel, and through the dance and just letting that go, to still connect even outside of planet Earth, even with people that might be like billionaires, Elon Musk, that's there building a colony. Yeah, maybe that would be a good way for humanity to really connect, like through music and dancing together. So just a throwaway question. Any ideas there?
Oh man, I think a mix of music would be great. I found that some of my favorite festivals are the ones that have all kinds of different music. Because if you're at a set and you're like, I'm not really feeling this set, you can go somewhere else, find a set that does work for you. But yeah, I mean, I guess my go-to would probably be like jam band music. But I think I have a special place in my heart for jam band music. That's probably why.
That's awesome. Yeah, first time I connected with it, because in England, I don't think that music's that popular. I never came across it. But I was living in New Zealand, and I had this really shitty car. It actually got thrown off a cliff by some random people. But I rescued my Grateful Dead tapes. It had a tape cassette deck. And so I had to climb down this cliff to get all my shit that was in the car, and I unscrew the license plate so no one ever found out it was mine. Yes. Anyway, so I rescued my Grateful Dead, and so those were the cassettes I listened to for probably 30 hours back to back, and I really connected with it. I'd never heard it, but something inside me opened up. That and John Coltrane's Giant Steps. I'd never heard it, but it was just found it for sale in a thrift store. And that was part of my life experience. So it's really interesting how different musical types go with us for journeys. But anyway, so that was my tangent. Gabby, wow, we need to stop, because we could just go on and on. Before we go, thank you so much for your work, for what you do at Psychedelic Grad, for all the lives that you've touched, for doing this important work yourself to become a doctor, and for folks that are listening that want to find you personally and Psychedelic Grad, just tell them where to go to find all your information.
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, I guess LinkedIn, that's probably, I'm not, I get on Facebook, but I'm not like super active on it. I just like, I get caught in like the death scroll, so they're probably not the best place. But social media wise, probably LinkedIn, you can search me. I can't remember if I'm Gabby Lehigh on there or Gabrielle Lehigh. But yeah, if you search me, I'm on there. You can also search Psychedelic Grad. We're on LinkedIn. That's probably our most active social media platform right now. You can find Psychedelic Grad at psychedelicgrad.com. That will take you to our landing page. You can check out our podcast episodes and our community and all of our other resources and fun stuff on there. If you want to connect with me through email, you can do so probably through the Psychedelic Grad email. But that's at Gabby at psychedelicgrad.com. So Gabby at psychedelicgrad.com. Yeah, that's probably the easiest ways. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thank you so much for having me. I gotta say, this is it took a minute to get this one scheduled. The dissertation process definitely turned me upside down this semester a little bit more than I thought it would. But I'm so grateful to have this opportunity and to really bring it full circle. My psychedelic journey started very much with, my fiance's interest in learning about psychedelics and the information and the resources that Psychedelics Today provides. And, this podcast being a huge part of that. So eternally grateful, both of us, honestly, for that. And so grateful to kind of share my knowledge and my research and all of this with your community and everyone out there that tunes in.
You got it. Honestly, it's a pleasure. Yeah, it's great that our circles are now one. And yeah, I was on your podcast and now you've been on ours. So it's cool being a guest, isn't it? I like being I like being a host, but it's cool being a guest. I don't know how do you enjoy being both now that you've done both?
I do. It's fun to learn about people, but it's also fun to talk about yourself sometimes, right?
Yeah, I love talking about myself. Yeah, never get enough chance to do it. But thank you. Honestly, it's been wonderful. I hope you enjoyed the episode, folks. And going to sign out. This has been David Drapkin talking with Dr. Gabby Lehigh from Psychedelic Grad. Take care, folks.